We're now joined by Zeenat Adam, who's the Deputy Executive Director for the Afro-Middle East Centre. Zeenat, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the programme.
Good evening, Peter. Thank you for having me on air once again.
The last time we spoke, it was just about the Taliban and the US pullout. So much has happened since then. What does this third element now of ISIS-K mean to the dynamic in Afghanistan?
I think that what we're looking at is a massive security vacuum that's been created. And not only the Taliban is to blame for this. I think we have to look at how we came to this from the last time that you and I spoke, when Joe Biden had made his statement shortly after the Taliban had taken over Kabul. In that space of just a few days, there's been the mass evacuation taking place. But what really has happened is that the Americans never really anticipated, or their intelligence was not sufficient in realizing that by handing over and by leaving Afghanistan, they would be left with such a huge security vacuum. And no one anticipated that last week the Afghan forces would simply lay down their arms and hand over to the Taliban. So it's been a really, really challenging week for everyone. In the meanwhile, you have the Taliban coming in. They've been warriors for a long time, but from a guerrilla warfare perspective. And when they did govern 20 years ago, it was in a very different atmosphere. What is happening now is a desperate attempt to try and have negotiations for an inclusive government so that there is a sense of governance. But to develop that statecraft, it's going to be a really, really long road for them. And the agreements around the airport and the evacuation, initially the Taliban had nothing to do with that. They were actually left out of it. The Americans were in control of anyone coming in and out of the airport area. But shortly after doing that, they realized that they weren't able to do this alone. They called on the Taliban to create a buffer zone and to try and help assist with the crowd management. That has been a really, really impossible task. The areas that were attacked today appear to have been under the direct control of the US. This was near Abbey Gate and Barron Hotel. And as you've indicated, a high number of American troops were killed in the explosions. We've heard that there's been other explosions since then, but as your reporter had indicated, there are some speculation that this is actually controlled explosions by the Americans trying to purge some of the data and information that they have before they leave. It's really a messy situation at the moment, and it's unclear how the Americans and the Taliban are going to be working together forward to try and resolve the situation.
All right, so that's the Americans, that's the Taliban, and I'm going to keep coming back to ISIS-K because they're not the only ones. There are other groups as well, aren't there, that are in and around this equation?
Well, Peter, Afghanistan has a milieu of people, and in the last 40 to 50 years, they've been at war. There's not just ISIS-K is a new entry into the space, but you've had various warlords, you've had tribal leaders, you've had different groupings. For example, in the last few days, we've seen resistance in Panjshir Valley from the Northern Alliance leader who adopted the Northern Alliance from his late father, Ahmed Massoud. They've been indicating that they want to resist and that they have some of the troops, but that resistance doesn't seem to be a very strong one. What we've heard is that the Taliban have surrounded the area and are indicating that they would like to enter into negotiations and to bring them into an inclusive government. It seems that that's not yet at a phase where we can say it's all hunky-dory and that they're going to be doing that. You then have a number of crime syndicates, and you also have numerous private military security forces that have been on the ground for the last 20 years, part of the war profiteering and military-industrial complex that was introduced as an outcome of the war on terror. Now you have people the likes of Eric Prince. You'll remember him from Blackwater. He has been at the airport saying that he will assist with evacuation, but he's going to charge $6,500 per person for evacuation. So it's again a money-making scheme. And essentially what we've seen in Afghanistan is the proliferation of arms that have gone into just about anybody's hands. And that means that you're going to have security issues, and that it will be the most prominent issue on the mind of the Taliban to try and bring security to the country before they can do anything beyond that. What we've heard from the ground and what we've heard from the Taliban is that this is their main priority, is establishing security in Afghanistan.
So what does President Biden do? He's got 12 troops that have been killed. Some people would be saying we need to revenge, we need to show that this cannot be allowed to happen. So does he fly in more troops to shore up the situation there? Or do they get out as quickly as they can and leave the Taliban to deal with what is left behind?
Flying in more troops is just going to extend the war that they've been at for the last 20 years. They went in trying to get one man, they got him 10 years into it, and thousands of people have been killed. If we look at the greater war on terror that came out of 9/11, over 800,000 people have died in these 20 years. I don't think that anyone has the appetite to see more people dead on the ground and bringing more bodies back to the States or burying bodies in Afghanistan. It's time that they leave, but there has to be responsibility that is taken for the last 20 years. They cannot be absolved of the responsibility of what has taken place in Afghanistan. And the lives of Americans are not above those of Afghans. I think that that has always been the case of an imperial power coming in and saying, well, we have to avenge these 12 lives. What about the 80, 100, thousands of Afghans who have died as a result of this war, and there has been no revenge for them? What needs to happen is they should have had a plan. They should have had an evacuation plan long before they decided to allow the situation to reach what it has today. There are some in Washington who are saying that they should not have given up Bagram Air Base and that the evacuations should have taken place from there because it would have been in a more controlled setting. However, this is the fait accompli. We have a situation where the Taliban is in charge. The Americans have given up. The American allies and those troops that they trained, 300,000 of them, whom they spent millions, billions, trillions on, have upped and left or have just decided to lay down their arms. And now there needs to be a plan of how to get out. The Taliban has indicated that they're not negotiating on the 31st of August as the cutoff date for that final evacuation. However, anyone who does want to leave beyond that date would be able to do so on commercial airlines. The question is, who's going to manage those commercial airlines when there's been this massive brain drain? In addition to that, the economy has come to a complete standstill with the IMF and the World Bank closing down the bank accounts of the central bank or freezing that. And this puts the Taliban in a very precarious situation because without those funds, it's going to be extremely difficult for them to get a handle of what needs to be done from a governance and security perspective.
In the very short term, it looks as if the Taliban and the Americans have to work together to try and get over this next hurdle. But can they trust each other?
I think that they've built up a relationship in the last 7 to 8 years during the negotiation. Were it not for that, they would not have reached the point where the Americans had agreed to the departure from Afghanistan. So there is a relationship, an existing relationship that has been built over 7 to 8 years. In the last week and a half, I think that has been a very complex relationship. We do know that the CIA is talking directly to the Taliban and that this is necessary. It's from an operational perspective more than anything, and there is intelligence that's being shared. So they knew that this attack was going to happen. Again, the question is, why was there not better preparation to try and avert an attack like this? And what would they be doing in the next few days and beyond that? Because I don't imagine that there would be a complete end to any relations. There's still interests that the Americans would have in Afghanistan, and there may still be American citizens who are left behind either by choice or because of the cutoff date, and that needs to be something that should be negotiated going forward.
Political capital, very important for the Taliban. They're trying to paint a picture of the Taliban 2.0. This is a new era, a new time. What do they need to do to show the world that this is a new Taliban in this instance, particularly dealing with ISIS?
Well, the first thing is that we need to recognize that the Taliban has not had a good relationship with ISIS. So I have noted that there are very Islamophobic sentiments on social media that seem to paint the Taliban and ISIS with the same brush. These are very, very different organizations, and they have not had a historical relationship with each other. The Taliban has come out very strongly condemning the attacks, but in the same statement that they had issued, they've also indicated that the Americans were in charge of the area and in charge of the security where the attacks had taken place. So again, trying to absolve themselves of that responsibility. I think what the Taliban is trying to do in the interim to show that they are the Taliban 2.0 is the confidence building measures. They're making amazing statements, but we have yet to see that translate on the ground. There's still a lot of apprehension by average people in Afghanistan, and particularly those who had worked within the government sectors in the last 20 years. This is the reason why there is a fear of brain drain and the Taliban appealing to people who are trying to evacuate and asking them to please stay and help build the country. I think that is one of the biggest challenges they have. Of course, the United Nations has come out very strongly, and various other countries have been very firm that they have in essence, tacitly accepted that the Taliban is in charge. But what is expected of the Taliban now is whether or not they will move in a direction of an inclusive government, as they have promised, whether they will try and maintain the security in Afghanistan and not allow attacks on foreign countries from their base of Afghanistan. And that they will give due human rights to women and children in particular, but to all Afghans. So I think this is where their confidence building measures have to come in. But we as the international community also have to recognize that they are coming in from a very different perspective. They've been at war for decades now. They have had guerrilla warfare against the Americans. They are in a position of having a bit of euphoria of having defeated an empire. However, they're also quite concerned about how they're going to govern. And I do get that from some of the members of the Taliban tweeting out. They are working very hard to try and have the necessary planning that goes in place. We also have to be conscious that they're not going to be doing this from a traditional democratic perspective. So we cannot expect that a perfect democracy is going to emerge in Afghanistan. They've been very clear that their country and their government is going to be an Islamic emirate based on Sharia law. The questions now is how do they negotiate the interpretation of the various elements of Sharia law and what that means for the average citizens in Afghanistan, what kind of civil society engagement will there be, whether the organizations that have been set up will still be able to function. And I think one of the biggest challenges they're going to face in the immediate term is the humanitarian situation, because you already had an impoverished population, several people or millions of people displaced internally, as well as refugees in neighboring countries like Pakistan and Iran, apart from these new evacuees who are going abroad. But inside of Afghanistan, the humanitarian situation is expected to deteriorate. There is no money. The economy is now at a standstill, and that is going to be a huge, huge challenge for the Taliban.
All right, so perhaps in the coming weeks it may be that the Americans and the international community might get its citizens out of the country and maybe even help a good number of Afghans that were loyal to them. But is that all that's going to leave Afghanistan? What might be the consequences that leave with them for the international community at large?
I think that the international community needs to also recognize that there have been serious war crimes that have taken place during the last 20 years. It's not just a question of up and leave as NATO and as the United States without considering the kind of actions that they perpetrated against civilians in Afghanistan. There needs to be accountability for that. There needs to be accountability for the American soldiers who decided to consider this. And there are numerous reports where they saw shooting at Afghans and killing Afghan civilians as a sport. There have been numerous reports of rape of women and children, of boys. There's been mass killings, and these need to be issues that the international community comes to terms with. There cannot be a complete blanket approval that America has left and that's it, and that's what they left behind. Going forward, the international community needs to consider whether they are going to give full diplomatic recognition to the Taliban or to the inclusive government that is going to be set up, of course, with the majority of the Taliban members in there, and whether or not that would include economic investment, and whether or not that would include appealing to the IMF and the World Bank to release the central bank funds. I think this is going to be a critical issue. When the G20 meet, all of these issues are going to be on the table as to what the recognition is going to be, what level of engagement there's going to be with the Taliban, and if that engagement does not take place, what other vacuums are going to be created? Because we're looking at a multipolar world, and you have Russia and China that are very interested in getting in on the action in Afghanistan, particularly with the immense resources, mineral resources that Afghanistan has. That cannot be tapped into without investors coming from outside. So it's going to be a very interesting dynamic. What we also need to be looking at, and this is particularly for me a concern from a South African perspective, during the war on terror, numerous South Africans were deployed and had gone to work as mercenaries, either joining the American military or NATO in Afghanistan, in Iraq, some of them still there, many of them working in private military security firms. South Africa is one of the countries that has the most progressive laws when it comes to foreign military assistance and when it comes to mercenary activities. In writing, we have perfected those laws, but we have never prosecuted any of these mercenaries, whether they have performed these acts in Africa or abroad. I was in government at the time that the Iraq war had happened, and I was on that desk, and that was one of the issues that I was very passionate about, because we cannot be exporting apartheid into these countries, and that we have no accountability for our own citizens perpetrating crimes elsewhere in the world.
Zeenat Adam, thank you very, very much indeed for joining us. Your insights greatly appreciated. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Peter. Have a good evening.
Thank you.